Good evening, and welcome to today's webinar. We have an exciting cast of speakers today and quite an interesting topic. Just a little bit about me. My name is Ashita. I am Assistant Project Manager at ORS. I do a lot of the programming stuff. But when I'm not doing that, I sometimes like to write. And over the course of the lockdown, my colleague and I, Terry Chapman, decided to look into the impact of the lockdown. Initially, it was only the Indian youth, the impact of the lockdown on the Indian youth, and we found some quite interesting revelations. So with that, we got in touch with Aakanksha, who is the founder of Reset, to sort of chart out a series of webinars that engage the youth from both India and the UAE and beyond on these questions that will definitely implicate our generation and, of course, generations thereafter. So before I start, I'd like to give a little bit of information on what Reset does. So Reset is an online platform that focuses on stories and resources around mental health and well-being, education, parenting, gender, and inclusion. It is one of the few publications dedicated to telling original stories around mental health and inclusion. And since its launch last year, Reset has collaborated with some of the world's most prominent thought leaders and government officials. So they are basically a go-to depository of everything from inclusion to gender to mental health. And it's great to have Aakanksha, who's the founder, on the first panel. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the panelists for today. We have Dr. Anthony David Murphy, who's a senior lecturer for psychology at Middlesex University, Dubai. We have Ishita Pateria, who is a counselling psychologist from India. And of course, we have Aakanksha, Tangri, founder of Reset. So without further ado, Aakanksha, take it away.
So Ishita, let me start by asking you to provide background on the mental health challenges that have cropped up over the past few months so our viewers get a sense of the landscape. What are some of the top concerns you're seeing among your young patients in India?
I think overall the anxiety level for everybody has increased quite a lot. And I think initially, specifically in India, when in March when the lockdown started, I think everybody felt a sense of solidarity, that the whole world was kind of stuck together, so they felt that they weren't the only ones. But I see now more and more that there's a sense of feeling left behind, because now you see Europe, etc., opening up, Dubai to a certain extent opening up, other parts of the world opening up, but India is opening up, but the state is still quite bad, given a COVID perspective. So I think it's increasing people's anxiety, it's increasing people's uncertainty. People have been trying mindfulness, etc., but I think they're just feeling quite stuck, and also feeling a longer and longer loss of time, which obviously affects the youth a lot.
You mentioned that the youth are feeling left behind, and according to the ORF report, 25% of respondents said that they're sitting idle at home because their jobs don't let them work remotely. There's also a looming fear of being affected by the economic downturn. Can you speak a bit about how this is likely to add to the already existing mental health crisis for young people, especially those from lower income families?
So I think overall it's a lot of people have lost their jobs. A lot of people now don't have the opportunity of getting new jobs because of the economic, environment. And I think that obviously it's affecting people's depression. It's causing a lot more OCD, because the more this is happening, people are not feeling in control within themselves. So that's why they want to latch on to other areas. But, in the lower income societies, they don't even have that space to kind of go get the help that they need. It's not, they don't have access to that kind of stuff. So it kind of leaves them a lot more stranded, if that makes sense. And also with, now various companies, etc., are starting to open up, and I feel that people who are in that situation, regardless of safety or no safety, don't really have a choice but go to work and earn the money and do what they need to do. But that obviously has a very negative effect on their mental health, because they're not really doing it because they want to. They're doing it because they don't have a choice.
Yeah, and like you said, that also, venturing out, they're putting themselves at risk, and that can lead to a whole other range of mental health challenges. So I know you said that people have tried mindfulness and, other sort of coping tools, but do you have any suggestions on how they can navigate this difficult time?
So to generally say, I think it really depends specifically it's a bit difficult to, if I were to say generally, yes, people should be trying mindfulness, people need to be actively using cognitive techniques, etc., to challenge their anxiety, to challenge their, thoughts that they have. They need to actively try staying away from a lot of the news channels, etc., so that they're not getting overexposure of news. Everybody kind of has to be focused on their own personal agenda, what they need to do, rather than letting them being affected by a lot of other external influencers. Right, so generally speaking, broadly, that's what I would recommend, but more than that, it obviously depends specifically on what an individual is going through or what, their background is.
Great. So as we're going along, to the people who've tuned in, please feel free to ask questions through the message box as well, and we'll, obviously address it with our panelists. So, Ishita, let me just also, talk to you a bit about sort of family. One thing that we've seen in the pandemic is that a lot of young people who had independence and extendable income, especially in the major cities, have had to move back into their parents' home, which has been, of course, challenging for them. And the results from the ORF study show that 35% of those staying with their family feel that their well-being has been affected. What are some of the points of friction within this dynamic that is leading to mental health challenges?
I think broadly speaking, when you move out, when you start living independently, you start feeling a lot more like an adult, and you're willing to take on responsibilities and feeling, like I said, again, you feel like you're moving forward. But I think as soon as you move back home, it's a sense of you've moved backwards, because you didn't really do that because of a choice. You've done that because you don't have a choice, right? At the end of the day, when you move back in with your parents, you then have to follow their rules of the house, their regulations, and however grown up you may be, at the end of the day, you're still their child. So you won't be treated as an adult the way that you were perceiving yourself when you were living independently, right? And the other thing that I would say is then, as opposed to when you stay by yourself and you're living according to your routine and your stuff that you want, now it's again back to trying to figure it out. I think the fact that we're working from home, a lot of us are anyways frustrated that we're not being able to step out, we're not being able to do a lot of things that we might want to. And especially if you're living in a flat, if you're living in a restricted space, then everybody's frustration is kind of going against each other, which doesn't really help because nobody has that venting space. So I think for families, it definitely has been extremely challenging. Most of my clients that I can tell you stem from this issue, because I think when it comes to economic instability, it's something that everybody has been preparing for and is something that can be voiced upon because it's a fact. But as for families, it's something that becomes a lot more emotional. So yeah, if that makes sense.
What advice do you have for a young person who is just, indoors and frustrated and having a hard time mentally because of being stuck indoors with their family for all this time?
I think it's really important that they set a routine for themselves. If they have a job that they're being able to do from home, it's very important that they organize that, and at the same time, they give themselves some time, something that they enjoy doing, something that they feel that makes them feel satisfied, makes them feel accomplished outside of just their job. At the same time, they need to take out some time for their family, so you're getting sometimes on your own and sometimes with people, so you don't feel isolated either, because we're not really stepping out much at the moment. I also feel that it's important to make yourself available to friends and family, because I also feel a lot of people who are staying with their parents are now feeling the responsibility that they can't step out because they're staying with elderly people, as opposed to them seeing other people who are staying alone, maybe being able to take that risk because they're not responsible for others. So I think it is really important to do one thing that you find fun every day, if that's possible. If not every day, a couple of times a week, couple of times do things that makes you feel that you've had a certain level of satisfaction, you feel like you've accomplished something outside of work, right? It's very important to create things that we look forward to. So that could be through friends, that could be through otherwise, but other than work, we strongly need to have certain things that we look forward to in our routine. And at the same time, try to organize a bit so that we're doing some things on our own and some things with family.
Got it. So, you mentioned loneliness, and let me just tell you some stats from the ORF report. 65% of respondents said that they felt lonely and isolated in lockdown, and 37% said that it had severely affected their mental health. And with the rate of infection still growing in India, the country is unlikely to return to normalcy anytime soon. How will these long periods of loneliness, impact mental health long term?
I think it's quite a scary situation because it's going to have a detrimental effect on individuals. I think that, like you said, the numbers aren't going down. We don't know when. Normalcy seems like something that's very, very far away. And I think that people are becoming rather lonely. I think they're trying to overall cheer themselves up on a weekly basis or on a daily basis. But overall, it is something that's quite scary, and that's why it's something that I think as as organizations, etc., it's great that you're looking into this stuff, because I think it is going to cause some serious problems.
Is it too soon to speak about the long-term implications this lockdown, for such a prolonged period will have on India's youth?
I don't think it's too soon, but at the same time, it also depends on how long it goes on for. Because on one hand, although we're not going back to normalcy, on the other hand, the more and more I'm speaking to people are getting quite fed up. And my concern is that they get fed up to a point that they start risking and going out and not really bothering. Because a big part of that has already started to happen. Even though things are opening up for economic reasons, people are stepping out. People are doing all sorts of things. If you go to a city like Delhi or Mumbai, people are out on the streets, right? And that makes you see that a lot of people are getting fed up. And I think the longer this goes on, and which also negatively impacts mental health, right? Because that's showing their frustration, that's showing their sense of irritation about not being able to do a lack of sense of control. So it all kind of shows how it's affecting the mental health, but I think the longer it goes on for, it shows different implications otherwise.
And how are mental health professionals like yourself preparing to undertake the responsibility of dealing with such a large population that is undergoing mental distress simultaneously?
So I know various organizations, they've started doing campaigns, they're doing webinars like this, because obviously when you do individual sessions, you can only cater to X number of people. So, taking part in as many webinars as possible, doing campaigns so that they're aware on the kind of help that they can reach out for. Obviously, it's easier in urban societies rather than rural ones, and that's the bit that is, concerning. But at least in the urban sector, it's about, reaching out to people, doing webinars, schools reaching out to students, societies reaching out to people on whether you need help. And I think in general what I've seen is in the last few months, people have become more open to reaching out, right? I think with all the stuff going on, the stigma, of course, is still very much there, but I think that it has helped in people reaching out more than it was earlier.
You mentioned that in the urban part of India, there is still, some organizations where you can have some support. Can you speak a bit about what's happening in rural India, if you have a sense?
I'm not so sure about it, so I wouldn't be able to speak about that.
Got it. And, we talk a lot about mental health of other people, but nobody really asks therapists how their mental health is doing. So I'm sure you've seen an increase in dealing with, patients and being inundated from all sides, and of course doing webinars like this. So, let me ask you, how are you managing your mental health?
So I have a therapist myself, who I see because I kind of need to work with my anxieties in the way that I have been feeling. And other than that, I've been maintaining my schedule too, which is I have X number of work hours, and after that, even though I stay with family, I take X amount of time for myself. So I give myself enough personal time, enough personal space for me to be able to do whatever I want to do. And I try to keep a weekday and a weekend routine So it doesn't feel like each day is going into the other day. And I still try to maintain weekends where I do more things, hobbies, things that I like to enjoy, and weekdays which are more work focused, so that you don't lose that sense of yourself or sense of what your life was.
Got it. And before I bring Dr. Murphy in, let me just ask you one question on a policy level. How can we as society better support the mental health of Indian youth, and what needs to change on a policy level to aid better mental well-being?
I think one thing is from a cost perspective, I know that a lot of people can't afford mental health treatments. It's not necessarily covered by insurance to a large degree. So if people become aware that that is something that they can, afford, it would help a lot. I also think it's about through policies, etc., creating more. I know people are doing a lot of work to create awareness, but also creating awareness that when someone works on your mental health, it takes time. I see a lot of people, educated people, coming and they feel it's a one-time fix, and it's not. And I think, a lot more awareness programs need to be created around that and about cost, because I think that's the other thing, that people, since, with medication, with therapy, it's something that takes time. I think cost is the main barrier that many people have, especially now when financially, economically, they're being affected too. So it's, I think, keeping those two things in mind.
Dr. Murphy, thank you for joining us as well. Ishita offered the India perspective, and like we said at the beginning of the panel, India is, still in lockdown, but here in the UAE, we have returned to normal life. It was the first day of school yesterday. We saw students, going out with masks and, carrying on. So let me just speak to you to, sort of set a bit of background to our audience about the situation in the UAE and what are some of the mental health challenges you've seen over the past few months.
Yeah, thank you for bearing with me, and I'm really pleased to be here speaking with you guys today. So thank you for welcoming me to the discussion. Well, the timing of the easing of lockdown in Dubai has been quite interesting, and indeed across the UAE. Given that children are now headed back to school, we're seeing an ease of some of the burden. But interestingly, lockdown itself did remove some of the factors for a number of, some of the risk factors for a number of mental illnesses, some of the triggers that might cause people's anxiety. So in some ways, speaking with a lot of clinical practitioners that I work with, there's been some discussion of people with anxieties and or depressive triggers in their life, in their day-to-day life. Some of them are being removed by not having to go out and engage with society that may have some risk factors for them. Obviously, those at-home isolation factors will be increasing risk for many others as well. Particularly as it relates to youth, I think that the biggest concern that I have experienced in the youth of the UAE has been this sense of uncertainty and the lack of control, or the lack of a sense of control that I think drives so much. We talk about uncertainty as this thing that's really risky for the stock market or for fiscal policy, but uncertainty when you have plans and when there are pressures on you to have plans that you plan to execute in a particular timeline, such as schooling, removing that certainty and removing a sense of control about it can be really quite damaging. And I think that in and of itself has brought about a number of the anxieties that we've seen among the youth in the UAE. And I think there has been some attempts to manage that using virtual teaching techniques and some really innovative tools to try and maintain a sense of order, a sense of routine, and a sense of structure. Isolation just doesn't complement uncertainty, and that is something that I think has really been evident in how the youth have experienced what COVID has done to their lifestyle on a day-to-day basis.
You mentioned isolation. That's not necessarily the case anymore for a lot of people who are now back to school, or even in-person offices have resumed. What are going to be some of the mental health challenges that will arise as people venture out into the world after months of staying in?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting challenge, and one that is very difficult to speak to on a population level in the UAE because it's so diverse. And there will be some people, for example, among the labouring groups who have needed to be out and working for quite prolonged periods of time. But the diversity makes it really quite difficult to speak in general terms about what the experience is likely to be for most people. But I think that there's certainly a sense of liberation at the same time as caution. And I think ensuring that that young people are really understanding the negotiation of liberation and caution will be a specific challenge in and of itself, because children are going to be children, especially in these times, and when they've been cooped up and potentially not been able to engage with their best friends and not necessarily fully understanding the risks of that, it can be a real challenge. And I think controlling that in schools and in collective environments is a challenge that we need to work quite closely to better understand the experience and how it's impacting specifically the youth in a stratified way.
You'd also said that early on, a lot of people who had social anxiety felt a sense of relief because of the lockdown and the fact that they could stay in. And now with the opening up, how will that impact them?
Yeah, I think that the reintroduction of some potential risk factors and triggers for some individuals who may be susceptible to depression or anxiety could be something that needs to be managed. I mean, going from 0 to 1,000 miles an hour in terms of interaction on a daily basis could be a new challenge. And I think ensuring that you understand reflectively, understanding your own risk factors can allow you to take some early intervention measures, if you like, to having an early awareness of your own sense of overwhelm or your own sense of anxiety or indeed your own sense of depression. Is it becoming increasingly difficult to wake up in the morning? For example, this could be an individual's early sign of maybe feeling a little bit depressed, and trying to understand reflectively our own risk factors and implement some maybe mental health first aid or some reflective mental health awareness just to try and get that early intervention before things become really potentially a bit more difficult to overcome. And I think the great thing, one positive that comes from this broader discussion, specifically on the backswing of COVID, is the fact that I think it is going to help to break down some of the stigma as it relates to mental illness, because it's going to have to be part of the discussion.
The Dubai Future Foundation found that one clinic here, according to research they had done, had noticed a rise in collective anxiety. And I know you're someone who works very closely with young people and with students. So what is if you had to give them one piece of advice or some words of support, what would you tell them?
Well, I think it would probably be along the lines of what I've been discussing so far, and that would be to try to understand your own early signs and try to catch them early and overcome. It's very, very difficult, but try to overcome the self-stigma and the broader collective stigma of your own anxieties, because catching things early and engaging early and trying to seek mental health first aid before it becomes more overwhelming than it needs to be could be a really positive step. And I think that really stems from a reflective awareness of your own risk and of your own baseline level of happiness, of vitality, and and you can try to reflect and think, am I finding it more difficult to get out of bed this week? If so, perhaps this is an indicator of something. Maybe I need to try and get ahead of this. And I think being reflective of that, and then seeking help proactively and early is what I would advise, and also communicating that effectively, because burying your head in the sand is something that never ever helps. And I'm thinking, from engaging with a clinician to also getting in touch with your teachers and your lecturing staff and saying, hey, before this becomes a problem, I need to let you know that I'm struggling with X, Y, and Z, and here are the support mechanisms that I need. They can be difficult discussions to have, but in the long run, they are going to be very, very helpful indeed.
One thing we've seen with COVID has been loneliness, whether you're staying alone or with your family. And Ishita talked about this, right? In India, we've seen a lot of youth move back home and live with their parents, which has been challenging for them. On the flip side here, a lot of young people, whether they're university students or they're working, they're away from their families. With the pandemic, what are some of the challenges that can stem from that?
Yeah, well, I think there are a number of different things that we need to think about here, because moving back with family doesn't necessarily mean not lonely. And it doesn't necessarily mean not isolated, because having to move back with mum and dad and spending 10 hours a day locked in your room watching live stream or watching TV or just being on YouTube all day, that is going to foster isolation and depression despite having people around you. So we really need to be aware of the risks of thinking I'm okay because I'm with family, but binge watching TV for 9 hours a day, the ill effects that is likely to have on our sense of engagement with the world is going to be a real challenge. And we know that engagement and contribution to a community, they really do help with our sense of self and our levels of happiness and well-being. So a key risk is thinking that because I'm back with family, I'm no longer isolated. Therefore, I shut myself in my room and I do what I want to do. I come out to eat like an angry teenager. Okay, but the flip side of those who are not necessarily with family and are having their friends move away from them because they have got family, the risks are kind of similar. This idea that isolation fosters depression, and there are a million and one ways that you can use the internet to kill an entire weekend without actually having to engage in the world at all. And that's one thing that we really need to be proactively trying to work to defeat, because in the UAE, I can press my phone and have my shopping and my food delivered to my door, and I can binge watch TV all day and never have to see anybody. And when you're feeling lonely and isolated, you can't necessarily see how and why that isn't good for you.
And, obviously here, while we're allowed to socialize, it still varies from to person about how people are venturing outside, and of course what their financial situation is, given how precarious everything is. So we've seen an increase in online activity, whether that's baking banana bread or all the workouts that people have been doing. What are some of the positives and the downsides of those who are turning to social media as a way to connect? And Ishita, I'd love for you to come in on this as well.
Yeah, I think we know that belonging to a community is a very, very useful thing, certainly for our wellness and our happiness and our sense of identity, and the idea that we can contribute to something that is greater than just us. So a sense of community can be really, really helpful. But there are many forms of community that might exist online that may not necessarily be as adaptive as we might hope. Obviously, however, we're seeing increased engagement with online workout videos, which is excellent, and there are so many useful and novel mediums that are emerging as a result of COVID. I mean, the fact that this is taking place is a testament to that, and we're becoming better and better at sharpening how and why we use technology. But I also think that if we fool ourselves into believing that technology is only good, then we risk never unplugging, we risk never detoxing, and leaving the house and engaging with nature and engaging with people in as much as we can, could well become something that we do less of, and I think that that is in and of itself a real risk. Not that I think people should be rushing out to meet or anything like that, but you know, I think in as much as we can safely, I think it's very beneficial to ensure that we are engaging with the world in the way that is possible, as well as, well, largely in order to complement the many ways in which technology has opened up new worlds for us.
Ishita, do you want to add to that as well from what you're seeing in Bombay?
I think I completely agree with the whole thing that you know, Anthony spoke about regarding technology. I think people are finding it more and more difficult to switch off. I think in the last few months, that's one thing that they strictly relied on what to watch next, how to connect with people through this. And I think that's why it's very important to actively switch off at a particular time, because if you think it will just happen, it doesn't. Right? Because that's our way of communicating with people, that's our way of feeling to stay in touch with people. That's also what is making us feel that we are belonging to something. It's all through the help of technology. But having said that, it's very, very important to actively cut that, you know, to switch off at a particular time. I normally recommend people that before they're going to sleep, at least an hour before, try to keep their phone away. They can keep it on like a do not disturb, which means that if there is any urgent call, they'll know about that. But, you know, other than that, they kind of get that time to detox. They get that time to kind of just reflect on how they're feeling. At the same time, I do think a sense of belonging, a sense of community is very, very important. And I have felt that, you know, a lot of people in the beginning were just trying to grab anything that they got. So even when you said in terms of seeing different things that were going on social media, or, you know, and I think it's important to kind of ask ourselves, what do we want to belong to? What is important to us, rather than trying to chase different things that you're getting. And I think in the beginning, what I noticed in, say, March, April, were people were trying to grab anything they got, because they were feeling so vulnerable, they were feeling so isolated, they didn't know how to cope. But I think as time is going, there are some who have managed to kind of ask themselves, what are the things I would belong to? And those are the people who are being able to cope better. And the others who are feeling isolated, who are feeling lonelier, who are kind of feeling that, you know, they've not managed that, are the ones suffering. So I think, you know, that's something that in treatments, through webinars, in awareness programs, that's something that needs to be highlighted.
Yeah,
I think
if I could add one more. Something that Ishita said made me really think that it's also worth trying to remind ourselves that social networking sites and apps like YouTube, they're very, very specifically designed to keep you on them for longer. Yeah. Even the games that we have on apps, they're very specifically designed to give you a reward at a certain time to keep you engaged. And so what Ishita said about actively unplugging rather than thinking that you will eventually is absolutely correct, because, you know, having a planned period of time, an allowed period of time, earn the time that you spend on social networking sites by disengaging from it for a period, because they're very specifically designed to tap into the same neural pathways as we see in addiction, for example, that just keep you on the treadmill of engaging with that product. So the idea of active disengagement is something that I think Ishita said that was really, really useful for us all to remain aware of.
Thank you.
Yeah, and before I ask you and turn to audience questions, let me just ask you one last thing. If you do have audience questions, please feel free to pop it in the question box, and our panelists will answer that. We're already getting a few in. So let me quickly ask you, Dr. Murphy, in the 2019 Arab Youth Survey, 31% of respondents said they knew someone with a mental illness. From a UAE perspective, obviously, the stigma still exists, but how can we as a society better support the mental health of youth, and what needs to change in, school and workplaces to aid better mental well-being?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and one that I think human resources departments across the UAE are starting to really, really engage with, because we're realizing that, work is an environment in which our mental health can be safeguarded if treated proactively and nurtured effectively. And certainly that can start much younger. So yeah, the 31% number doesn't surprise me one bit. But what I think we can start to engage with is we're seeing an increased number of organizations providing mental health first aid training. And these types, the more people attend this type of training, or the more people gain awareness of this type of training, the less stigma there needs to be, because an early engagement with these discussions in the workplace, in the school environment, among our friends, will help us all to realize that getting ahead of things earlier and using open discussions in order to do that only serves to decrease the amount of suffering that any individual has to experience. So more open discussions in the among friendship groups, among the family, and saying, I'm not feeling okay. And saying I'm not feeling okay isn't saying there is something wrong with me. And I would like to feel more okay isn't saying I need to go and see a psychiatrist. And I think being able to have those discussions more proactively and more broadly, and those discussions being modeled effectively within our communities, and seeing community champions who are able to represent the cultures in which they exist, talk about these things from the top, and it not be a sign of weakness, and that be modeled certainly to the youth, would be a real benefit. I'm not sure if that's answered your question explicitly, but yeah, these are the things that immediately spring to mind.
It definitely does. I'll just open it up to the audience now. So we have a question from Vandana. Ishita, I think you can take this one. Can you focus on the slum population? How can we reach out to slum students and offer services?
I think already there have been some NGOs and some other organizations and companies who've been doing that. I think it's important to keep highlighting to them that mental health is as important as physical health and other things, because I feel what's happened in the last few months is because they've had such bigger stressors. For example, a lot of them have run out of jobs, a lot of them have been unable to travel to work, etc., that they've not gotten the space to actually pay attention to their mental health. They've not had the support to kind of be able to concentrate on that, and I think that's the area that needs to be highlighted the most, that although you're going through other stressors, this is also something that needs to be highlighted, because it goes hand in hand. You can't concentrate on one and not the other. And in general, given the stigma that mental health has, especially in lesser educated populations, it's important to start that from schools, from areas like Anthony was saying, because then that it ingrains you to start thinking like that from a young age, which then is very, very helpful.
And we have another question. Either of you can take this. What would you like to say about people having to deal with the grief of having lost a family member due to the pandemic, during the pandemic, either due to COVID or otherwise?
Yeah, that's a really difficult thing to experience. I've had a number of friends and family and colleagues who have experienced loss during the pandemic and haven't been given, they've almost been robbed of the opportunity of grieving in the way that they would prefer to, or the way that they would like to, or the way that traditionally would be experienced by their culture. And I think that it's one of those terrible things. And I personally can't think of anything other than it's a sacrifice, and I mean, I hope that anybody who has experienced any form of grief during this pandemic has found a way to manage their grief effectively. And I think that is one of the chief goals of the grieving process as it exists within, the ideas of funerals, of wakes, of shivers, etc. They're designed to celebrate the life and provide a forum for the grief of the loss. And when you're deprived or indeed robbed of the opportunity to do so, it's important to find an outlet for that grief that is adaptive for you, because if not, it can just build and build and build and become this thing that just fosters resentment over time, and then you feel the sense of being robbed of the opportunity to grieve in the way that was needed at the time. And it's like a pressure cooker, grief, and you can allow the pressure to be released before it builds up into this thing that could cause, serious damage if left over time. So what I would like to say to people who have experienced grief during a loss during COVID is, please, where possible, seek an adaptive way to let out your grief and to experience the grief in the way that you need to. And that I personally am just really, really sorry that circumstances have dictated that you've experienced this loss during a time where you've been robbed of your opportunity to grieve in the way that you might need to collectively. Yeah, Ishita, please, over to you.
I absolutely agree with everything that you've said, because people are not being able to find closure. If somebody passes away in a hospital, they're not being able to see the body, they're not being able to, come to terms with their grief, something that otherwise, starts the process, they're not being able to. And I also see that another thing that's happening is that usually when we're going through any form of grief, we rely on family members, on our support system, and our friends, other people, who come to help us. And in these times, we're not being able to do that because A, they can't physically come to us, but also emotionally, they're quite occupied with their own stuff. I'll give an example. I know of a couple of weeks ago, somebody who passed away, and rather than the person, the only thing that they spoke about was, oh, were they COVID positive, and does that mean I'm at risk, and are you at risk? And it totally goes away from the actual loss of a person to its impact on everything else but that. And I think for people grieving that loss, it's really difficult. So I completely agree with Anthony of individually asking what is the way we can grieve and allowing yourself time and space to be able to do that, because these are really difficult times. And it is very, very hard to be able to do that at this time.
Yeah, and it's a bit cliche, but also reminding yourself to focus on celebrating the life as well as coming to terms with and grieving the loss. I think they are equally important in helping one to come to terms with the loss of any loved one.
Thank you both for answering that. Our next question is based on a little bit about family that we spoke about. So the person says, I'm not getting along with family. I find my home environment very mentally disturbing, but I can't talk about this to my friends as well. I have to stay here whatever I feel. I try reading books, watching movies, but it is not working. So I think one other thing we've seen during the lockdown has been an increase in, obviously mental health challenges, but also people having to live with families where there's a toxic environment and having to deal with that. And we've seen an increase in domestic abuse cases as well. So what advice do you have, for people in situations like these? What can they do?
Yeah, in line with that, we've seen the emergence of a number of charitable organisations that will also provide support, a number of community support outlets, and indeed a number of clinics that operate on a for-profit basis, allocating certain periods of time to pro bono work in order to ensure that those who are most vulnerable and those who are most at risk, who maybe don't have the resources to fund counselling, may find it possible to access. So I would say that you're talking about reading and watching movies. These are all things that are quite isolated. And if there's a way that you can pick up a phone, call a clinic and just say, hey, I'd really need to chat to somebody about this because it's getting me down and I need to get ahead of it. And do you have any pro bono hours that I could just use to talk to a counsellor? And try to think about maybe engaging with some of the professional, or a trainee counsellor might have hours that they need to get, so might not even be charging. They might need to get their hours up in order to gain their qualification. So thinking about how you can expand the professional network where possible.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I'd like to add to that is, in addition to, like Anthony said, that reading and watching movies can be quite isolating. I think reaching for pro bono help is great, and in addition to that, even them joining any interactive classes, so like an interactive group workout, not individual classes, but there are lots of online courses, classes, hobby classes, things like that are going on. People are doing virtual group cooking classes together, anything that's interactive. So you feel, it gives you that sense of community. It makes you feel that although I'm staying with family and if I'm not getting along with them, that's all right. I can have my own space, own life, which doesn't have to be so isolated or lonely. It can be with, with the help of others too.
Yeah. And friends can be the family that you get to choose.
So Ishita, this next question is for you, and it ties in with what we're already talking about. How can one access affordable mental health care in India?
I think there are lots of organizations, NGOs that are available, but overall it is difficult. I know that the government, tied up with a few organizations which were giving you, I think, one session, and some others which were giving you a few sessions. But I think overall it is difficult, and that's why I said that, with policies and stuff, it's something that we look into, because we do have a huge population, and how many ever organizations offer, it's less.
And then the next question, Dr. Murphy, you like this one as someone who works with students. How can we involve students and youngsters online on a platform to be emotionally stable, energized, and positive in this current environment?
How can we engage students in a platform? That's a great question. One thing that I find students are really, really keen to do is to gain experiences that are going to be useful in their next steps. And I think engaging students in platforms that will allow them to gain experience that they see as fitting within the context of their intentions. I'm thinking specifically about psychology students at the moment, but I think any platform that complements what they're doing, as well as providing them with skills and opportunities and a sense of community, it is probably going to be quite useful. So, any that provide CV development, internship, trainings, upskilling, that doesn't feel like top-down teaching, but feels more like a bottom-up engagement, is one strategy that I would advise, and to make it so that students can clearly see how it fits in with what they're doing in order to contribute to their next steps and their next goals, I think is something that students are really, really interested in trying to explore. Yeah, that is one piece of advice that I would suggest.
Ishita, do you have anything to add on to this?
I think it would be nice also perhaps to, do a survey in schools, etc., to kind of understand what are, to that particular school, to that particular environment, what are the kind of things that are going on, and then kind of creating, like in your student body movements, kind of having that platform also to kind of talk about these things, finding a panel to be able to, stimulate emotional behaviors, to kind of stimulate mental health talks. I think that may be helpful as well.
And one last question before I hand it over to Asta. Do you know of approaches to introduce mental health care from early on, say with a 2-year-old child? Ishita, do you want to take this one?
I'm not a child therapist, so I wouldn't be able to comment too much on this. But there are, there are various things that you can do with children. There are many techniques that you can start with 2-year-olds about having them to be able to process their emotions. Obviously, it's not so much with talking, but it's about, you can do play therapy, you can do art therapy, you can use other mediums that can introduce the element of mental health and can help them. And I think it goes in line with the child and the parents, because the parents have to help stimulate that. but there are definitely various approaches that can be introduced.
Yeah, and I think that you tapped into a really useful part there when you were talking about modeling that in the parents, and parents modeling to children that it's okay to be vulnerable and okay and to talk about that vulnerability is a great modeling step from as early on as possible.
Great. Thank you to both of you for your insights, and to ORF for having Reset on board. I'll now hand it over to Asta.
Very much. That was great, and of course, it's something that we can talk about for ages. It's mental health. I think, especially during now, it's something that, especially within the Indian context, even though it was starting to get mainstream, I think the lockdown really sort of put it on the forefront. And what was really interesting, Dr. Murphy, you mentioned this sense of engagement. I think that really sort of articulated what I myself, but I'm sure a lot of my peers are going through, that there is this disconnect, because you're spending so much, especially in the case of India, as we are phasing out our lockdown, but mostly it's where we've been inside since March 13th. But you forget what the outside world looks like, and you become untethered. And I think that really amplifies a lot of the emotions that you're going through, which are, of course, not as positive as you'd like them to be. So that is something that I really appreciated that you articulated. But yeah, thank you so much, Ishita, Dr. Murphy, Aakanksha, for joining us. It was great to have you on. And thank you so much for the audience who joined us and sort of gave us incredible questions to ask. And the video, all the collaterals will be available on our website and our social media platforms. So we hope to continue the conversation there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good evening.